Evelyn Dorne's abandoned house held walls of defaced photographs. Marcus Veylor's polished smile masked a hidden network of cruelty. Clara Mivens' obsession dragged her into the very nightmare she studied. Lyle Corven's twisted psychology turned people into experiments. And Detective Rowan Cade uncovered a truth so disturbing it was sealed away forever. On the outskirts of a quiet town, Willow Lane stretched into silence, a road most avoided. It was there that an abandoned house stood, its windows shattered, curtains half-hanging and swaying with the wind. Neighbors whispered about the place, claiming it carried a curse. Some said they saw a faint light flickering inside late at night. Others complained about the strange, foul odor that had started to seep through the street, like a warning. For weeks, no one dared to investigate. People crossed the road rather than walk past the gate. It wasn't until the smell became unbearable that a call was made to the police. What they found inside would shake the town forever. The officers entered cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the layers of dust. The walls were damp and peeling, but what caught their attention were the photographs. Hundreds of them, pinned unevenly across every wall, overlapping each other like a collage of forgotten lives. Faces of men, women and children stared back, some smiling, some unaware they were even being photographed. Each photograph had been tampered with. Deep scratches ran across the faces, lines carved violently with a sharp object, erasing identities and leaving behind only hollow images. The officers felt the weight of the silence pressing down, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The deeper they moved inside, the more unsettling the details became. In the living room, a series of notebooks lay stacked neatly on the table, each one filled with fragmented writing, half-sentences, coded words, and strange symbols that seemed meaningless at first glance. Every page contained names, some recognizable from the photographs, others completely unfamiliar. The handwriting was erratic, sometimes scrawled in haste, other times written with slow, deliberate strokes. But the true horror waited in the basement. The door creaked open with reluctance, revealing stairs that descended into darkness. The smell grew stronger with every step, thick and suffocating. The beam of a flashlight swept across the room, revealing an old trunk pushed against the far wall. Rust ate at its corners, and a heavy lock clamped it shut. After forcing it open, the officers froze at what lay inside. Human bones, arranged in patterns that resembled symbols, as if each piece had been carefully positioned for a purpose. Some bones were polished, others still bore signs of decay. There were no random piles, no chaos, only deliberate placement, like a grim display. Against another wall, jars filled with unknown substances sat in rows. Some contained soil, others strands of hair, and a few held objects like broken jewelry pieces or small toys. It was as though the basement was part laboratory, part shrine. Every item was connected to someone who had vanished without explanation. When the property records were checked, the name tied to the house was Evelyn Dorne. She had lived there quietly, barely noticed by neighbors. Months earlier, she had disappeared, leaving behind unpaid bills and a silence that seemed almost intentional. Before her disappearance, Evelyn had already been whispered about. Rumors linked her to two missing individuals, though no evidence was ever found. Some dismissed the suspicions as gossip, while others believed she was dangerous. Now, the discovery inside her home turned suspicion into certainty. The town was shaken by the revelations. The house on Willow Lane was no longer just abandoned. It was a crime scene etched into memory. People gathered at the police barricades, straining to catch glimpses of the officers carrying out boxes of evidence. Parents held their children closer, realizing that the missing faces from the photographs had once walked the same streets. Investigators tried to piece together the puzzle. Who were the victims? Why were their remains arranged so meticulously? And most importantly, where was Evelyn Dorne? Some speculated she had fled to avoid capture, while others believed something darker had happened, that Evelyn herself had been claimed by whatever evil she unleashed inside that house. The basement became the focal point of the investigation. Every bone, every object, every photograph was catalogued, but even with so much evidence, there was no clear story, only fragments that pointed to something more elaborate than a single person acting alone. The journals hinted at meetings and partnerships, suggesting Evelyn was part of something much larger. For the community, Willow Lane transformed into a symbol of fear. Children were warned never to step near it, and adults crossed themselves as they passed. The smell eventually faded, but the memory lingered. No one could erase the image of bones arranged like puzzles in the dark, or the silent stares of the defaced photographs covering the walls. The first chapter of the case had begun, and already it was too disturbing for most to comprehend. Marcus Veylor had always been a name spoken with respect in the town. His face appeared in newspapers, smiling as he handed out oversized donation checks to charity. He was the man who organized food drives, sponsored youth sports teams, and gave motivational speeches about hard work and community pride. To many, he was the backbone of the town, a figure people could trust without question. But beneath the carefully constructed image was a truth that no one could have imagined, a truth that connected directly to the horrors uncovered inside Evelyn Dorne's house on Willow Lane. When investigators searched Evelyn's journals, Marcus's name surfaced again and again. At first it appeared as notes written in admiration, referencing him as a guide or the leader, but as detectives studied further, the tone shifted. Pages revealed strange instructions signed with initials matching his name. Symbols in her notebooks matched logos from some of the very charities Marcus had funded. It was no coincidence. Evelyn's life and the lives of several missing individuals had threads pulling back toward the man who was supposed to represent everything good. Investigators began looking into Marcus quietly, knowing that if word spread too soon, panic would erupt. They dug into his finances and found that his charities, which were celebrated publicly, had secret funds moving into untraceable accounts. The money trails showed a darker purpose, resources funneled into securing isolated properties, purchasing obscure chemicals, and making payments to names that investigators suspected were tied to the miss. The cheerful community leader was not just hiding corruption, he was managing a hidden network. As evidence grew, a chilling possibility took shape. Marcus wasn't simply associated with Evelyn, he may have been orchestrating her actions from the shadows. The photographs in her home, the coded writing in her notebooks, and the objects collected in her basement all hinted at a system too organized for one woman alone. Evelyn had been a participant, but Marcus appeared to be the one ensuring it all ran smooth. The image of Marcus as a generous leader clashed with the reality uncovered. Neighbors remembered his kind words, his presence at school events, his role in local government meetings. He was always where he needed to be, shaking hands and reassuring people of his commitment to the town's future. Yet that very visibility may have been his shield. No one questioned a man who gave so much, and no one would have suspected that the smiling figure behind the podium could also be pulling strings in crimes too disturbing to voice aloud. Investigators found that several of the missing individuals listed in Evelyn's journals had last been seen at charity events sponsored by Marcus. Flyers and photographs connected them to gatherings where Marcus was present. The horrifying pattern suggested that his public appearances were not just about building his reputation, but also about selecting potential victims. Evelyn's role became clearer. She was likely tasked with following those chosen, luring them into her world of secrecy, while Marcus kept his hands clean in the public eye. When this information began to surface within the investigation team, shock turned into fear. If Marcus had been able to operate so openly for so long, how deep did his influence run? Was he working alone, or was there an even wider circle hidden beneath the layers of respectability? His name was tied to civic leaders, law enforcement donors, and wealthy investors. If he was exposed, the fallout would destroy not only his reputation, but the town's faith in the systems they trusted. Behind closed doors, detectives argued over how to handle the case. They knew they needed more proof before they could confront him. Evelyn's disappearance left gaps in the puzzle, and without her testimony, they had to rely on what she left behind. The journals were their strongest weapon, but they read like a mixture of confession and coded devotion. Evelyn wrote about Marcus as though he were both a savior and a master, someone she feared yet relied upon. The contradictions made it difficult to know how much of her words were real and how much were products of manipulation. The community, unaware of the storm brewing, continued to celebrate Marcus. He gave another speech, smiling for cameras, praising the town's resilience. All the while, investigators watched from the shadows, knowing the man in the spotlight was not who he pretended to be. Beneath the polished surface of generosity was a web of control, power, and unspeakable cruelty. What began with Evelyn's journals had now placed Marcus Veylor at the center of a nightmare, and the truth was only beginning to unravel. Clara Mivens was not a name anyone expected to become part of the story. She was a 20-year-old criminology student, quiet in nature but driven by an obsession that few understood. Unlike others her age, Clara did not spend her nights at parties or scrolling endlessly through her phone. Instead, she buried herself in crime reports, old newspaper archives, and missing persons flyers. For years she had tracked the strange disappearances in her town, creating timelines and maps no one else had thought to piece together. Her friends dismissed it as a hobby gone too far, but for Clara it was more than fascination, it was compulsion. When the news of the Willow Lane house broke, Clara was already prepared. She had files of her own, thick binders filled with connections she believed the police had overlooked. As investigators revealed photographs covering Evelyn Dorne's walls, Clara felt a chilling sense of recognition. Many of those faces were the same ones she had been studying. For her, it was confirmation that the pattern she had noticed was real. The dates of their disappearances, the places they had last been seen, even the symbols she found scribbled on random flyers, all of it was part of something bigger. Clara's notes showed that every disappearance lined up with certain anniversaries. Some were tied to civic celebrations, others to obscure historical dates only a dedicated researcher would recognize. She realized that these crimes were not random acts of violence. They were part of a sequence, ritualistic in structure, almost ceremonial. The discovery terrified her but also gave her purpose. She believed she had solved what the police were only beginning to understand. Her findings grew even more disturbing when she noticed a pattern in the symbol. Flyers for charity events sponsored by Marcus Veylor sometimes carried subtle designs that mirrored the markings in Evelyn's journals. To the average person, they looked like harmless decorative flourishes. To Clara, they were codes, reminders of specific anniversaries and targets. She began to believe that Marcus's public face was not just a cover for corruption. It was a stage on which he announced the next act of horror to those who knew how to read the signs. The deeper Clara dug, the more names she uncovered, and the more connections pointed to someone else. Lyle Corven, the town's most controversial psychologist. He had a reputation for unorthodox methods, claiming he could rewire the human mind through suggestion and exposure. While some saw him as eccentric, others quietly questioned his ethics. Clara discovered that both Evelyn and Marcus had been his patients at different times. The realization struck her as more than coincidence. If Evelyn's journals described Marcus as a guide, then Corven might have been the architect. Clara's research showed that Corven had once published papers on obedience and fear, theories that suggested people could be pushed into committing acts they would normally resist. Though his work had been dismissed by professional boards, Clara saw eerie similarities between his writings and the patterns in the crimes. It was as if the town itself had become his experiment, with real lives used as pieces in a twisted study. Her notes painted a terrifying triangle, Evelyn as the pawn who carried out the groundwork, Marcus as the respected figure who ensured protection and cover, and Corven as the one pulling the strings from behind the curtain. What frightened Clara most was that no one else seemed willing to connect those dots. The police were moving slowly, bound by evidence and procedure, while she could see the broader design clearly. Clara knew she had ventured too far when she realized her own name had appeared in forums connected to the missing. Someone had noticed her research, and whether it was Marcus, Corven, or someone else in their circle, it meant she was no longer an observer. She was a potential target. The photographs on Evelyn's wall had once belonged to strangers.
but now she felt as though her face might be the next to appear among the defaced images. Her obsession, once academic, had become dangerous. Still, she couldn't stop. Clara believed she was the only one who could unravel the full truth. Every night she stayed awake, mapping dates, marking symbols, and chasing down small pieces of information. She no longer trusted anyone, not her professors, not her classmates, not even the investigators she once admired. The case was no longer a subject of study for her. It had swallowed her whole, and though she didn't yet realize it, Clara's determination to expose the truth was leading her directly into the center of the nightmare. Lyle Corven's name had lingered on the edges of the case like a shadow, but once investigators began digging into his past, the shadow grew darker and more defined. Corven was not an ordinary psychologist. His career had been marked by controversy, with colleagues accusing him of crossing professional boundaries and experimenting with theories that most considered dangerous. While some saw him as brilliant, others described him as manipulative, someone who treated human beings not as patients, but as subjects in an unending experiment. When Clara Mivens traced both Evelyn Dorne and Marcus Veylor back to him, the pieces of the puzzle began to align in a terrifying way. Corven's office records revealed that he had worked with both of them years before the first disappearances began. Evelyn had been treated for social isolation and paranoia, while Marcus had attended sessions under the guise of stress management related to his public responsibility. But the more investigators studied the files, the less they looked like therapy notes and the more they resembled conditioning manuals. Corven had written observations, not about helping his patients recover, but about testing how far they could be pushed. He detailed Evelyn's tendency to obey authority figures without question, and Marcus's ability to compartmentalize guilt while maintaining charm in public. In his own words, they were ideal subjects. The journals in Evelyn's home mirrored phrases that appeared in Corven's paper. Phrases like ritual reinforcement and fractured identity stood out, terms that matched Corven's obsession with breaking down the human mind to rebuild it according to his design. Investigators realized that Evelyn's disturbing arrangements of bones and Marcus's coded charity events were not random expressions of cruelty. They were orchestrated behaviors rooted in Corven's psychological conditioning. He hadn't just influenced them, he had programmed them. The most disturbing discovery came when police uncovered a manifesto hidden in Corven's private study. The document, over 200 pages long, described what he called the Dark Evolution Project. In it he argued that humanity's true nature could only be revealed through acts of controlled horror. He believed fear, obedience, and ritual were the keys to stripping away societal masks. Victims were not described as people, but as variables. The manifesto suggested that every disappearance, every ritualistic act, and every manipulated subject was part of a grand design. Corven saw himself not as a criminal, but as a scientist reshaping human morality. Yet, by the time investigators pieced this together, Corven had vanished. His office was found abandoned, files shredded, computer drives destroyed. Witnesses claimed they had seen him driving out of town days before the Willow Lane house was uncovered, as if he knew the investigation was closing in. What he left behind was not evidence of his current location, but a trail of psychological devastation. Evelyn, Marcus, and perhaps others unknown, had all been set loose as extensions of his will, carrying out the remnants of his twisted project, even in his absence. For Clara, who had been tracing these connections on her own, the realization was paralyzing. She had suspected Corven was the architect, but the scale of his involvement was worse than she imagined. He had not simply manipulated two people, he had built an entire framework that could sustain itself even if he disappeared. Clara began to question how many others might have been his subjects, how many seemingly ordinary townspeople might still be following instructions buried deep in their conditioning. Detective Rowan Cade, leading the case, understood the weight of what they were facing. To prove Corven's guilt was nearly impossible without him present, and even the evidence they had uncovered felt like fragments of something much larger. Cade feared that exposing the full truth would not only destroy the community's trust in its leaders, but also risk panic on a scale no one could control. The decision was made to classify large portions of the evidence, sealing away Corven's manifesto and his treatment file. Still, the damage could not be undone. The photographs in Evelyn's house, the money trails linked to Marcus, and the rituals tied to Corven's theories all pointed to a chilling conclusion. The crimes were not acts of individual madness, but part of a systematic design created by a man who saw himself as above morality. Corven's disappearance left an open wound. Some believed he had fled to another city to begin again. Others whispered that he never left at all, that he was watching from the shadows, waiting for the next stage of his project to unfold. The investigation reached a breaking point, caught between truth and containment. What lay at the center was Corven's influence, an invisible hand that had turned ordinary people into monsters. The question no one could answer was whether his absence meant the nightmare was over, or whether it had only just begun. Detective Rowan Cade had worked dark cases before, but none clung to him the way the Willow Lane investigation did. From the moment he stepped into Evelyn Dorne's basement and saw the carefully arranged bones, he knew this was not just another crime, it was something calculated, something meant to leave a mark. Cade had carried the weight of past failures, families left without answers, and victims whose stories remained unfinished. He promised himself this case would not end the same way. Yet the deeper he dug, the more he realized that resolution was not something this investigation could provide. It was a wound too deep to ever close. Cade spent sleepless nights retracing the evidence. He studied Evelyn's journals until the words blurred, read Marcus's financial records, and until patterns revealed themselves, and reviewed Clara Mivens' obsessive notes about anniversaries and symbols. Each document added another layer to the nightmare, but instead of clarity, what emerged was a web too large to untangle. He saw how Evelyn had been conditioned, how Marcus had hidden in plain sight, and how Clara, despite her youth, had uncovered truths that even seasoned investigators had missed. But what unsettled him most was the realization that none of them acted entirely alone. Corven's invisible hand tied every thread together. As Cade followed the trail, a horrifying truth emerged. Evelyn was not just a pawn but eventually a willing participant, finding purpose in carrying out rituals that Corven had planted in her fragile mind. Marcus, the polished leader, had used his charm and influence to protect the group, recruiting resources, and ensuring suspicion never landed too close. And Clara, though she began as an observer, had crossed a line without even realizing. In her desperate need to expose the truth, she had inadvertently spread symbols and patterns that continued Corven's design. She had become part of the cycle she was trying to stop. The case files grew thicker, filled with details Cade could never release to the public. He wrote reports that would remain locked away, documenting how ordinary people had been turned into instruments of cruelty. He understood now that Corven's experiment had succeeded in ways no one wanted to admit. It was not just about obedience or manipulation, it was about transformation. Once touched by Corven's influence, people no longer returned to who they were before. Evelyn, Marcus, and Clara each carried his work forward in their own ways, as though his absence only made his hold stronger. Cade tried to confront Marcus, gathering enough financial evidence to push him into a corner. But Marcus responded with the same calm confidence he always displayed, smiling for the cameras, shaking hands with officials, and reminding everyone of his supposed generosity. Behind closed doors he was untouchable. His connections ran too deep, and every attempt to bring charges against him stalled in legal complications. It was as if the system itself had been conditioned not to see him for what he truly was. Evelyn remained missing, her name whispered like a ghost through the investigation. Some believed she had fled to escape capture, but Cade suspected something else. Her journals hinted at a final ritual, a plan that suggested she would one day disappear, leaving only her legacy behind. Whether she was alive or dead, Cade knew she was not finished. Clara spiraled deeper into obsession. Cade watched her struggle, realizing she had become both a victim and a danger to herself. The more she uncovered, the more isolated she became, convinced that no one could be trusted. Cade feared she would eventually vanish like the others, swallowed by the same darkness she was trying to expose. At the center of it all was Corven, absent yet present in every detail. His manifesto described the crimes not as random murders, but as a necessary unveiling of humanity's true fate. Cade read those words again and again, haunted by the possibility that Corven's disappearance was not an escape, but a continuation. Perhaps he was still out there, waiting for the next stage, or perhaps he had already left enough influence behind to ensure the project never ended. When the investigation was finally sealed, Cade sat alone in his office, staring at the closed files. The case was officially complete, but he knew it was far from over. The community would never hear the full truth. The photographs, the symbols, the rituals, and the manifesto were locked away, marked too disturbing for public release. Streaming platforms and publishers rejected the story, not because it lacked evidence, but because it revealed something most people could not bear to confront. Rowan Cade carried the truth alone, haunted by faces on Evelyn's walls, and by the knowledge that evil did not always arrive as a monster. Sometimes it came as a neighbor, a leader, a student, or a healer. Sometimes it smiled in photographs, shook your hand at a fundraiser, or offered help when you felt weak, and that was what made it unbearable. The case was over on paper, but in Cade's mind, it would never end. It was too disturbing for anyone to face, and that was precisely why it would be forgotten, buried in silence, while the shadow of Corven's experiment lingered on.